Hello all, and welcome to another AP US History video. The purpose of this is to introduce you to historical thinking skills that you're going to need to master in order to pass and hopefully excel in the AP US History exam next May. So first off, you may be familiar with the fact that 2 years ago there was a redesign of the AP US History exam. And in case you're curious as to why that is, a lot of it is because the previous AP US History exam, and all history exams for that matter, were very much focused on skills that really shouldn't matter, in my opinion, when you're becoming a history scholar. You're not necessarily meant to be a trivia master to be a good history student. If you forget an exact year once in a while, that doesn't mean that you don't know your stuff, right? So the previous AP US History curricula have been criticized because you were assessed in a lot of ways, especially in the multiple choice section. You were assessed at how well you could memorize and not necessarily how well you could really synthesize and analyze the information. So they're making a huge change with that. So along with that, the second point here is that really what the AP history courses are now trying to do is make you think like an historian. And the idea there is encapsulated in these 4 historical thinking skills that I want to outline to you now. So just as a brief summary, these are the skills. Just so you know, these are the same historical thinking skills that apply to AP Euro, which was redesigned for this year, and also AP World. So you can see them right here. Crafting historical arguments from historical evidence, chronological reasoning, comparison and contextualization, and historical interpretation and synthesis. So let's go into these with a little bit more detail. And I also just want to give you a warning. Unlike a lot of my other PowerPoints and flipped classroom videos, this one doesn't have any pretty pictures. The only thing you can see that's fun is my face, and maybe you don't want to see it, maybe you don't miss me at all. But anyway, just to warn you, this is not really the most aesthetic presentation. So let's go over the first skill here. And all of the skills are broken down into sub-skills. So for crafting historical arguments from historical evidence, the first sub-skill that you need to know how to do is to essentially create historical arguments. So you are familiar with this even if you haven't taken an AP history course before. Writing history, you have to write a thesis statement. And if you haven't, you're probably not getting high marks on your essays. And frankly, you probably don't belong in an AP history course, although maybe you're up for a huge challenge and not only want to learn the content, but also master a new skill. So maybe I shouldn't prejudge, but ultimately this is something that you probably already should know how to do, right? So basically, in order to make a historical argument, you need to be savvy enough to weigh a variety of evidence, make sure that you're acknowledging that there's a counterpoint to your argument. So it's sort of like being an effective lawyer. Okay, so if you watch, crime shows, or if you have a lawyer in the family, I know it's not 100% accurate, but say you watch Law & Order SVU, right? When you're watching that show, ultimately you might realize that if you're a defense lawyer, for example, you're trying to defend someone who is accused of murder, if there's some sort of evidence that the prosecution is presenting to try to make your client look guilty, you probably don't want to deny that that evidence exists. Instead, you want to acknowledge that evidence, but then turn it around and explain why that evidence doesn't matter, right? So hopefully that makes sense. We'll talk about it a whole lot more this year. But in order to get the highest marks, not only do you present an argument, but you also turn around and say, okay, it's true that some historians argue X, but ultimately Y is the better case because blah, blah, blah. Okay, the second sub-skill is appropriate use of relevant historical evidence, and that kind of goes along with historical argumentation. You can't make a good historical argument unless you've evaluated a series of evidence. So this means that you need to be considering various sources. So you need to be considering secondary sources like your textbook or other historical interpretations of the past. You need to be considering primary sources. You also need to keep in mind the point of view of the author, right? So for example, if you're talking about the repercussions of the Civil War and you're reading something that came from someone from the South, someone from the former Confederate States, you might want to acknowledge that they might have a more sympathetic approach towards the South after the Civil War because of where they came from, if that makes sense, okay? Also, you just need to be able to evaluate sources, right? You need to maybe criticize a source, you know? This person has a bias because, and that goes along with point of view. Okay, the next skill is chronological reasoning, okay? And there are 3 sub-skills that are associated with that. The first one is historical causation. So again, let's use the Civil War as an example. You probably have enough background knowledge about the Civil War to know that there is a variety of causes that led to it, right? You can be very simple and say that it was the debate over slavery, but then you can go into much more sort of analytical detail by explaining also that there is growing sectionalism, right? Conflict between states based on where they are, based on what kind of economy is sustaining those states, right? How dependent are they on slave labor? Westward expansion, wars with Mexico. Some of this you may say, what, Miss Sutton? It's okay. You haven't read this yet, but you're going to realize that that was something like the Civil War. Okay, there's a variety of causes. Also, we'll talk about long-term versus short-term causes. How about we take an example from Euro, since you all took it last year? How about World War I, right? The short-term cause, you probably remember, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right? But then long-term causes, remember the MANIA acronym, right? So remember that militarization, the alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and so on. These are the important long-term causes that in many ways historians would say made the war inevitable. So to be a good historian, you have to be able to explain a variety of causes for a certain event. Okay, the next one is continuity and change over time. You'll find that on the AP exam there actually is a continuity and change essay. So it's really important in this category for you to be familiar with how as time passes, certain things change dramatically, right? So think about industrialization, how things as maybe simple as living standards change, but also something, you know, maybe a little bit, maybe that you want to think about right away, like fashion also changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Also with continuity and change, you need to consider what things have not changed as time goes on, right? So again, if you're talking about the Industrial Revolution, consider that certain socioeconomic groups maybe did not really experience as much of an improvement in their living standards, okay? Periodization is the third sub-skill here. So in a lot of ways, the AP redesign sort of does this for us. They break AP US history into 9 different historical periods. Okay, so what you need to do with periodization is to understand why a certain person, a certain event, a certain ideology sort of fit into a given time period. But again, in order to be a really strong historical student, you also kind of can put continuity and change in here and think, okay, this historical period, you know, is similar to this historical period because blah, blah, blah. Okay, the next skill is comparison and contextualization. So sub-skill 1, comparison, is something, again, that's probably very familiar to you in your previous studies of history. Even in middle school history, you were probably asked to compare and contrast something. So think about how you did that. Also realize that the College Board calls this skill comparison, but they actually also imply that you should be contrasting. So if there's an essay question that says, compare the development of the New England colonies with the Southern colonies, if you just compare, if you just explain why they are alike, you're not going to get full points. You also have to explain the differences. So I know that may seem like a trick, but just know I'm telling you right now, and I will repeat it throughout the year, that comparison means compare and contrast. Okay, and then contextualization. This also relates to continuity and change, which was skill 2 that we just did. So basically, again, just like if you're reading an historical novel, which I know you've done in English class, what you need to do here is figure out, what time period something is happening. Here's an example. Okay, so I don't know if you read A Tale of Two Cities in your European Lit class, but you've probably heard of it. It's by Charles Dickens. It follows London and Paris during the Industrial Revolution, right? So if you were to read this book, probably part of your English class was actually explaining the significance of that time period, right? And why this book was written and why it matters. Okay, same kind of thing. So even though continuity and change was in the previous skill, when you do contextualization properly, you're also doing continuity and change over time. Okay, and the final skill is historical interpretation and synthesis. 2 sub-skills. First is historical interpretation. So the first term here below you might not know, but I want to introduce it to you. It's this term called historiography, which I did in grad school mostly, but a little bit in undergrad. What historiography is, it sounds like a circular definition, but what it is the history of writing history. Again, an example. Let's take the JFK assassination. Now, immediately after JFK was assassinated, it is likely that most historians were very sympathetic towards JFK because he was killed. He suffered an untimely death, right? And many other things that go along with the nature of his presidency. But then as time goes on, right, maybe historians took a more critical approach towards JFK. Maybe they brought up things like the infidelity, his notorious affair with Marilyn Monroe, right? And other things, of course, like maybe whether or not he would have gotten the U.S., obviously we were entangled in Vietnam, but, kind of his approach towards Vietnam, his approach towards the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so on. Okay, so it's important for us to realize that historians don't always see an event the same way. Okay, so to a certain extent, they change their opinions over time, and also, the background of an historian is going to affect the way that they see an event. And also point of view, the position of the historian is important here as well. So where are they from? What's their bias? Okay, last one is synthesis. So synthesis is essentially kind of a conglomeration of all these different historical thinking skills. The idea behind synthesis is that you need to use all these different skills in order to fully analyze and understand a given historical era. And that may sound vague, but we'll talk about it much more throughout the year. Oh, my apologies. This is I did a similar presentation for AP World, and this is the link to the AP World website. But let me get out of here and show you our website briefly. I'm running out of time here. But if we go to our website, start at the home page, you'll find that there are more resources here. If you go to the AP Prep tab, you can also just click AP Prep up top. By the time you get here, this video should be also at the bottom of this page. But you'll see that I put the thinking skills right here. If you click on it, it actually will take you to a chart that shows the historical thinking skills, which hopefully will be very helpful to you. That's loading. Also, the themes of AP US History, which we talked about in a previous presentation. You can click and find a little chart there that also talks about the bagpipe acronym. If you have not already watched it, definitely check out the video that I posted earlier that links the summer reading to the themes. And also, if you're really adventurous, you can go to the College Board website and look at the course description, which is overly long. I wouldn't necessarily, it's not really light summer reading. But if you really want to get an in-depth understanding of the course, you could click here. But my purpose as your teacher is to also break down how you understand and how you master the course without having to read this overly long course description. That's my job. That's what I do. So I think that that's it. I only wanted to give you this video to introduce these ideas. You can certainly use them as you're reading Red, White, and Black, but the assignment has much more to do with the themes. So if you don't master these thinking skills, and if this video leaves you a little bit befuddled, don't worry too much. We will be spending the whole year mastering these skills. So I'll be in touch. I'll be updating these videos all summer. I'll be updating website all summer. So I will see you next time.